of our colored Civil War troops. Please understand that I know the appropriate term is black, but when you go digging and you do some introduction to the colored troops, that's what they were called during the Civil War. So that's why we are referring. I also have my expert here who knows a lot of the descendants, Vicki Hudson Swisher. So please refer any really deep questions in the ones that are connected to Crawfordsville. We'll figure it out. You didn't think I'd do that, did you? No. All right. So I need to take you back in time, and I need to take you back to when the 28th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops were formed. This is in Indianapolis. I can't tell you the exact address, but I know there was a really cute little deli right on the corner that, of course, we had to hit after we went. But this was the 28th Regiment from Indiana. This was the only colored troops that the blacks could join. Oliver P. Morton, God bless him, he was quite a story among himself. When he was governor, he kind of dragged his feet and didn't really want the blacks to join. And because of that, a lot of our black soldiers went to other states. And I'll introduce you to one of them this evening. I introduced you to a couple before, and I've got a few more after that. But it wasn't that the blacks didn't want to join. It's just that Abraham Lincoln in 1863 finally said, okay, we're not winning this with just ourselves. At that point, he really didn't have a general. Grant was just coming to the forefront. And so Lincoln decided to pull out all the stops. And that's when Governor Morton finally dragged his feet. And by January 1866, they were welcomed home. Some were welcomed home as heroes, others found that nothing had changed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, the 28th was incredibly active. These are the places that they served. We're going to focus primarily on the Battle of the Crater and then their dismissal in Texas, because we think a lot of our black residents that were Civil War veterans that were from elsewhere, we believe they met as they were preparing to muster out in 1866. And because they had no home, they could go back to the plantation, but some of them had run away from their plantations. So it just was a matter of, where do you want to go? They knew they wanted to be free in a free state, and they chose Indiana because luckily we had enough black citizens who served that brought these people back with them, and we're very grateful for that. So the Battle of the Crater, this is where we believe a lot of our black soldiers really saw the elephants, so to speak. The Battle of the Crater was one of those, he said no, let's change our mind at the last minute and let's just watch a whole lot of people get massacred kind of situation. I will not go through the whole thing because there's lots of books that have been written on the Battle of the Crater. But we were in Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, Virginia was just not given up. And so Grant et al. Decided it would be a really good idea to dig a hole underneath the Confederate embankment and then blow it up. We had a lot of West Virginia and Virginia miners in the white corps because, of course, we had to be segregated, and most of the black troops were led by white men. There were a few exceptions, but very rare. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, that's actually pretty accurate. Besides, it's got Denzel Washington in it, so who wouldn't want to watch that? But anyway, the idea was they would dig a tunnel underneath the Confederate embankment and then blow it up. And then the black troops, the 28th, was to storm the area, take care of any last survivors. Petersburg would fall, the war would be over. And then politics got involved. And again, I will not read you this whole thing. Just understand that George Meade, Ambrose Burnside, and Ulysses S. Grant found themselves in quite a quandary. White soldiers did show up to the Petersburg area, but they had been force-marched, they were exhausted, and the black troops had been training for this exact exercise for months. Why? Because they were there and they needed something to keep their attention. I mean, any soldier, black, white, pink, purple, or polka dotted, gets a little bored and gets into trouble if they're left alone for a long enough amount of time. So the black troops were fully aware of what they were going to encounter. They were fully aware of the situation. And then July comes along. Meade changed his mind about the black troops going into war. It is thought by Meade biographers that he had a very big dilemma. Number one, if the black division went in and proved themselves in battle, he had a big problem because now blacks should be allowed to enter the armed forces with equal pay. And he was very concerned that if the blacks proved themselves, that he had a political nightmare on his hand. Or if the blacks went in and got massacred, he'd have a political nightmare on his hand. So he felt that he was in a catch-22. Please understand that in all the literature I've read, the blacks were ready. They knew what to do. And so Ulysses S. Grant comes in and pulls the plug and says, nope, the blacks are not going in. We're going to send the exhausted white troops in who have had no training. And I don't even need to tell you the rest of the story of the Battle of the Crater. I think we all know what happened. Less than 5 hours before the battle, Colonel Henry Thomas, who was in charge of this particular part of the 28th, received the message, and he delivered it to his troops. And as he says in his memoirs, he said it was met with disgust, anger, disbelief, and most of them said, not surprised. What do we do now? You wait. And the 1st Division, I can't remember who actually ended up going in. Brigadier General James H. Liedel's 1st Division was the lucky winner who was to go in after this alleged collapse and blowing up of the Confederate division. But he didn't tell his troops because he was ticked. And he went home and had a pity party, got drunk, and provided absolutely no leadership to his white troops. And it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. There were over 250 Confederate deaths, mass confusion, but the tide quickly turned because it didn't go as well and the whites were not trained. So it was an absolute massacre. And then, to add insult to injury, 3.5 hours after, approximately 50% of the 28th fell, of the black troops fell at the Battle of the Crater. The good news is that the 50% that survived regrouped and watched Petersburg eventually fall, and were one of the first groups to go into Petersburg to take control. And while it certainly isn't good news, at least there was a little bit of respect there. So, some of the reason I point out the 28th is if you'll notice, a lot of our gentlemen from here joined the 28th. That's all they could join. So our first gentleman, or next, I guess this is part 2. So our next gentleman I want to introduce you to is William Boone. And tracing him was an event because, as you can see, there's lots of different spellings for his name. His father was Daniel Boone. We have no idea where he was born, but we think it was in Kentucky. His mom was Lizzie. She was born in Indiana. We have no idea how they met in 1841. He enlisted in 9 February 1865. He was a private and he was a barber, and that was his primary job for the 28th. He eventually died in 1907 of something called Bright's disease, which I had never heard of, but apparently it's a kidney, and it was apparently a really hard way to go. I mean, at that time they had zero help at all, no medicine, no nothing. His funeral was conducted at the Bethlehem Church, of which we believe he was a member. Here's the neat part. We think his father's name being Daniel Boone is because he was a slave of the Daniel Boone, or his brother Squire. We're just not clear, but based on things that we have read, things that are in the newspapers, but we believe that he was indeed connected with Daniel Boone, the Daniel Boone. Another gentleman you've heard me talk about, if and when I get to heaven, this is the gentleman that I want to meet me, hopefully my parents, if they're there, I want them as well. It's the black gentleman who is looking away from the camera in the middle. This was a reenactment of a slave story out of the Alamo area. This was done at the 1906 Centennial in Crawford's Woods, which is now the Lambda Chi Alpha House on Wabash's campus. That was Henry Crawford's Woods. The story goes that there was a slave that had been captured in our county, brought into town, and was just shackled to the back of a wagon. Well, his bounty hunters decided it would be a good time to wet their whistle excessively, and luckily the bartender saw what was going on and kept plying them with alcohol. Well, the butcher, who is portrayed on the very left, that is Alfred, who played, the gentleman who is playing him played the butcher by the name of Alfred, who went and unhitched this slave who allegedly ran to the Speed cabin. The slave, who Robert Hopkins is portraying, had a white tuft in his hair, which made him easily identifiable. Mrs. Speed decided it would be a good idea to pluck all those hairs out, let his hair grow back, and then we send him on his way. That's one of the Speed cabin stories. But Robert, oh, what a fascinating human being. He is one of these that was born on a plantation in Kentucky to the Hopkins family, or Mary Bush Hopkins, whose father, Samuel Hopkins, could trace back to the Revolutionary War of 1812, was a lawyer, was a congressperson, blah, blah, blah. And they had a lot of property. And General Samuel Hopkins was an individual who was doing genetic engineering, even though he didn't know he was doing genetic engineering. And Robert worked on this plantation. The things that he grew, he would load on barges and head down to New Orleans to sell at an exaggerated price. We believe Robert Hopkins was one of those who would be on the ferries going back and forth. We believe he was a trusted slave. Mary Bush Hopkins was quite a piece of work. She was the last of the Hopkins children, never married. And during the Civil War, the Federal soldiers came knocking on her door and told her, you either take the allegiance to the United States or we're going to take over your territory. You are a rebel. And according to Mary Bush Hopkins, she said, yes, I am a rebel. So was George Washington. You want to do something about it? And the Union Army left without having her sign the allegiance letter. She did live to see the Civil War end. She died in 1874. We don't know whether she gave permission for Robert to leave the plantation or not, but what we do have is we know he left. He enlisted on 26 August 1864, Company C of the 118th Regiment of the 28th. It was in Owensboro, Kentucky.
Shannon, a quick question for you on this. Then Hendersonville, are we talking about the Hendersonville, Kentucky, which is directly across from Evansville?
As far as I know, yes, because Robert, and we believe so, yes. I won't go into that whole story, that's too long. Now, here's what's neat about Robert. During his service, he was promoted not once but twice, which just didn't happen. He was promoted to sergeant in 1865, it was very clear, he was at the Battle of the Crater, and then in 1864 he was promoted again, and then we believe he was one that met people from Crawfordsville and came to us in 1866. We were very fortunate. We have his military work, his paperwork. He could not read and write when he enlisted. Obviously, you just didn't teach slaves to read and write at that time. But we have his X, and that's all we have. We don't know that Mary Bush Hopkins gave his permission, but he very freely admitted from what plantation he came from. which is very interesting because a lot of slaves, if you look at these, the slaves did not admit where they were from because all the owner had to do was come and take them back, and that was never a good situation. We know that he was 5'4". He had copper skin. He had black hair and black eyes, and he listed himself as a laborer, which here in Crawfordsville, that's exactly what he was. He was a day laborer in all the later censuses. Unfortunately, Robert apparently lost a lot of stuff in his time, and he was consistently getting fined. Now, whether it was lost or stolen remains to be seen, but in this particular document, he lost his haversack and therefore had to pay for it. But he was quite a character. He did survive the war, came home, and he apparently learned to read and write at some point. We don't know where, we don't know when, but in later censuses he designated that he did. He married twice. His first wife died in surgery. His second wife outlived him, and it was Josephine that admitted him to the United States Hospital. They called it the Senile Hospital in Hampton, Virginia. He had dementia. He had heart problems. For heaven's sakes, he'd served in the Civil War and was 90. I'd have senility and dementia problems as well. And he died over in Illinois, and then he was brought back here for burial, and he is in one of our Oak Hill cemeteries. All right, this gentleman, William Jordan, he was also known as Gordon or Jordan. It depended on how he was designated in the censuses. You want to take this one?
Yeah. That was my great-great-grandfather. No, yeah. And he was also a minister in the AME church. It was called AME Church until 1920 or so.
And when they added the
And
Bethel.
then they added the Bethel on, so that's why sometimes it's referred to as AME Church or Bethel. But yes, he was a lay minister at one time.
So we have royalty in the office.
And my great-grandmother, Edna Hyde, she went down and had his Civil War, after he was a soldier, she had a gravestone.
She had the headstone, yeah.
Headstone.
Because a lot of these Civil War gentlemen, if you're black, you didn't get a headstone.
No.
You had to apply, and often it took years to get a headstone.
She was 13 when she got married in 1900.
She was 13 when she married him?
No.
When she got married?
No, when she got married, she was 14.
She was 14. Oh, well, gee. That it just makes you realize this is a completely different world. He lived on Tuttle Avenue. Eventually, he lived with Herman King, which was also a local preacher. Is he a Second Baptist or is he?
I think so.
He was Second Baptist. That's what I thought. He was also with the 28th. He survived and lived to age 86. He was a member of the Bethel as well as the Colored Masonic Lodge, which was very, very active in our community. And Vicky's already taken the last part. And this is Vicky's relations. Jackson Newkirk. Jackson was born in 1833 or 1834. We have records of both in Fountain County. He married Amasa Ann Martin in 1857, had 4 children, and this guy, rather than stick around here, decided it would be a really good idea to go to the gold rush. And apparently he didn't do well because he enlisted in Company F, Colorado 2nd Infantry in October of 1863, and then came home. Now, what's fascinating about this gentleman was he received a full blacksmith title. It's unclear whether he received the same pay as a white blacksmith. I'm guessing not. But the fact that that is on his military records is pretty cool. He obviously saw service because he had several wounds which crippled him. Eventually he went to Illinois for the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's just right across the state line. It is a fascinating place, and they have a library in which you could get lost for days. I did. And then he is here. He was buried here. Corporal Adam Ritchie or Abram Ritchie or Ritchie, it just depended on which military record and or census you looked at. This gentleman was born in Indiana. He eventually lived in Vigo County. We're not clear how that happened. Then he was in Park County. Then he joined up with the 28th Regiment. But he was a corporal. And for that rank, that took quite a bit. I believe in those days you had to be recommended by your peers as well as your white officers. Now, don't get me wrong, there were a few regiments that were led by black men, but not many. And he barbered also for a living after he returned here. Henry Warren or Wayman, he's found both in the census. He was born about 1845 to slave parents. We believe he was also a slave. He enlisted in Company D. He was one of those that was discharged in the Texas area. So therefore we believe that's how he got here. In the 1870 census, he was boarding with another Civil War soldier, the Wycliffes. By 1880, he was married, working as a day laborer, and by 1900, he was a widower and living on his own. He also died at the Danville, Illinois Soldiers' Home, and again, their records are for the time period and for blacks. They are extremely well done. Neat thing, prior to his illness, he'd already gotten rid of everything he owned. Why? Because he wanted it to go to his families. And he bought his own burial plot. Which, you know what? He was going to do it his way. I remember Frank Sinatra, singing Frank Sinatra as I was writing his biography. He was known as Uncle Henry in the community. He was, quote, and this is from his obituary, he was one of the city's true characters, which I'm sure he probably was. And he obviously was very highly thought of in both communities. Now, I am up for time, but I do have part 3. And these are the 2 gentlemen who were white officers for black troops. So, actually, I have 2 minutes, but I'm not going to get started. So, this is part 3 if Diane ever needs a part 3. And as a teaser. Okay, questions. I will do my best.
My great-grandfather fought in the Civil War for the North, and he died of Bright's disease. Bright's disease is the old-fashioned name for congenital polycystic kidney disease, of which my father had. So he inherited it.
So it's inherited.
From his grandfather.
And cyst on your kidneys is never a good thing. No. And as I understand it, back in these days, it was an awful way to die. There was no dialysis, there was no medicine, there was no surgery. Your kidneys basically failed you and you poisoned yourself, as I understand it.
My father was on a dialysis for 2.5 years before he died. And we had one of the bedrooms at home turned over to a laboratory for him. And yeah, it wasn't nice.
No, it's a hard way to go. And even now, as I understand it, it's still difficult because there's just not much you can do. You can't operate every time the cysts return.
Everyone, my sister, my brother and I, and all of our kids have all been tested and we're all clear.
Which is a good thing. So it must be recessive, double recessive. Either way, I can't imagine in those times. The beauty of the gentlemen who returned was that they stayed and they raised their families and they became members of the Bethel and the Second Presbyterian. And they all worked hard for what they had. Some of the addresses are on Tuttle Avenue in that area. Several of them are up on Spring Street and then on the East End, which Beach Street, Vicki, is that right?
Yes.
The Beach Street area across from Lincoln School. So they stayed in the community and we are a better community for it.
Another thing, how did you find out that John Newkirk was a black soldier?
Well, honestly, Deli, you want to take this one?
No, I don't remember it.
Oh, you don't? Well, Deli, when we first got my second Lilly grant, Deli found a book that had it was just a white chart, in a book, and for the life of me, I can't even tell you what book it was, but it listed all of them that had served, and that's where we started.
It was the Montgomery County history book, the one that was done in the 1980s. That's what it was.
And Deli just happened, God bless Deli, she just happened to remember seeing it. Plus, if you go downtown at the courthouse, they have that large monument. I don't know if that plaque was taken from that or not, but that book was where we started, and then that just opened up other avenues, because once I found one, I could go through the rolls of the 28th, which is a book about that thick, and all I had to do was find Crawfordsville. And then that's how we found the Bias brothers, John and Jerry Bias, whose children went to Lincoln School, and I believe their descendants are still here. So it was just one of those, we had, Deli found the door that opened, and it went from there. And then we were able to find out where they served, thanks to, if you're familiar with Fold 3, as part of Ancestry. That again is a rabbit hole you can go down. There aren't a whole lot of really good records. Robert Hopkins, I don't know how I got lucky to find those, but it was just a matter of calling. I actually called the United States, at that time they called it the Insane Asylum in Hampton, Virginia, and I talked to this wonderful lady, and I told her what I wanted. I said, look, I know I'm looking for a needle in a haystack. She goes, oh no, I've got it right here. I will be out in 9 hours. No, but she sent it to me, and I didn't pay a penny, but I sent her a humongous thank you. So, and then the Danville home for Civil War soldiers, they're renovating it. It's kind of dilapidated at the moment, or it was when I was over there a couple years ago, but they've got some really cool records as well. But again, rabbit hole, you just go down and you just never know who you're gonna find.
Well, I've done quite a bit of research of the Newkirk and the Fruits, and they lived in and around Wallace and Alamo, and they were all white people.
Oh, well, that doesn't surprise me, because, and Vicki, you can help me with this, when you left the plantation, you picked your last name, because chances are you didn't have one. Some picked their former owners' names, or
just, like my great-great-grandfather who escaped from the plantation he served, but he picked George and Georgia in order to throw off, but his last name was Churchill. Bethel, the AME church was known as the Church on the Hill because that's where it was located. And so he picked his name from the church. And so that's when his sister Georgia, who he rescued from the plantation in 1864, I think they named him Georgia because to distract from them coming from Virginia. Because my grandfather always teased Georgia when he called her Virginia all the time. So we think that because she was only 4 and not registered anywhere, you know, that name was just stuck to her in order to distract from, they didn't know how the war was gonna turn out. So she was told to stay hidden, and she stayed hidden on the property she was never in the census or anything for over 100 years. And this weekend I found a reference to a memorial paying in a missionary meeting for the AME church for when she passed in 1963.
And I love the story when they took her uptown for the first time.
Yeah,
She was
She
90.
didn't go anywhere. Yeah, she was 103, we think, but they didn't have exactly,
Who knew?
you know, and so her brother, who was in the country, speared her off the plantation and brought her all the way through the battles and everything to Crawfordsville. And so after he passed, his wife Janaya, who was from Canada,
Yeah.
so she took care of her. And then after she passed, then Aunt Mary so she was always taken care of, but she never went downtown.
She was
never
afraid.
left because she was afraid. She didn't go to school. She didn't even go to AME church. And so when Daddy and Grandpa asked her one day, do you wanna go downtown? And she said yes, and so they were excited, so put her in the DeSoto and with the little windows, and she sat up and rode the car for the first time, saw downtown, buildings stacked, and just was in wonder. And she was gone a couple of weeks later.
This is, if you're familiar with Sam Churchill, the baseball player, who was at the courthouse, he worked at the courthouse.
Yes,
This is this connection, which is part of the Lincoln School, which that might be in a few years when Vicki and I get that done.
yes, because Uncle Sam, he was Georgia's youngest nephew. You know, and so
Played semi-pro ball.
it played semi-pro, and introduced my dad to, at 8 years old, to Satchel Paige.
Oh, wow.
And so he played for the Indianapolis Clowns.
Yeah.
And so by the time Daddy got old enough to play, he had Satchel Paige's mitt, which was like 2 pieces of cardboard. So when he played for Crawfordsville High School, they had to get him a new mitt, because that was like, you know, not
Dangerous.
standard and dangerous and all that. But, so, and I found out recently Daddy got a scholarship offer from Purdue, IU, Franklin, and went on to play AAA ball.
Your father did?
Yeah.
Get that recorder out. Get this stuff.
So he actually got to go up to the Cleveland Indians. That was he played for the farm team for the Cleveland. On weekends, that's what he was doing. Supplemental income. I never knew this growing up.
You see why I brought her.
And so, yeah, he said, I said, well, did you go on to college? Yeah, I went to Purdue on a baseball scholarship. And so what happened, he said he got spiked. So because of the sports scholarship, he had to, you know,
Because those are hard to recover from.
And so that's when he went on to play for the triple, you know, for the farm teams, and then eventually AAA ball.
That, I see, Vicky's next month, no, I'm kidding. I don't think she is, but she should be. Yes,
What all do you know what teams in the minor leagues he played for?
I didn't know enough to ask about the, you know, I was just going,
Yeah.
you know, as he's telling me, it's just off the cuff. And, he played for, he went up for the Cleveland Indians, so I don't know what the name
At
of
one time, the Indianapolis Indians were the AAA affiliate for the Indians. They mostly have been Cincinnati a couple of times. Right now they're Pittsburgh, but I remember they were Montreal Expos, which are now the Washington Nationals. But
Yeah, so he played for, you know, Uncle Sam taught the white team how to throw a spitball. He had some, he chewed
oh wow.
tobacco all the time. Daddy said he threw the ball, they'd be dripping. You know, and stuff.
Yeah, I get outlawed.
Yeah, and stuff, so, yeah, he showed him how to show the knuckleball, sliding, and all that. But he was too old by that time to switch over to
That's
the,
enough flesh,
majors.
flesh them out.
Wow.
But
That's
he did
awesome.
play
Satchel
for-
Paige.
Also have coffee.
Wow.
and when we work on the Lincoln School project, which we are, it's in full steam ahead. Sam is a graduate of the Lincoln School,
Yes.
and he is one of those that will feature once we get to that point. We're just kind of dipping our toes in a very deep ocean at the moment, and it's getting deeper by the minute.
Yes, he wouldn't play, he didn't go to high school because the coach at Crawfordsville did not want black players.
And that's why he got his letter jacket when he
That's
was,
Daddy,
oh, it was Daddy.
that was
Okay.
Daddy.
That's right, I remember that.
So he didn't get his leather jacket until 2 years ago.
It's been, I cried through the whole thing.
Yeah, so,
Wow, that's amazing. I'd love to hear a lot more. So how many in total, do we know how many in total, or we have a good idea, how many African-American black soldiers in the Civil War came back to Crawfordsville, or do we
No,
have a roundabout idea?
I'm guessing probably close to between 12 and 15 from our research. But it's, if you wanna go upstairs and look at the Underground Railroad book, there's an entire section on our black soldiers. And you're more than welcome to any part of it. And what's fascinating is I had to write that so fast because I was on a Lilly grant. I have binders more of stuff that we've been, that Deli has accidentally come, oh, here's another piece I found. Or I've had people call me up, or Vicki and I have accidentally undug something, and what we're finding is the Lincoln School and the Black Soldiers very close, like the Bias brothers, as I said, their kids were there. So we are still digging. And before I die, I am going to do our very best to have their stories told.
Yeah, and baseball has a really good connection because baseball was getting so big during the Civil War. That was
You bet it was.
so
Absolutely.
that carried in.
Mhm.
So is the AME church still active, or is
Yes,
it
we are.
okay?
We're celebrating 175 years.
How many or around about how many congregation members do you have? How many people attend?
On a regular basis,
Yeah,
maybe
just-
10, maybe 10,
Okay,
but half of those are not African American.
okay.
Very integrated. In fact, we're gonna put that as a plug this summer in the genealogy minutes, because I believe I can say that everyone's invited. And when the Bethel does an anniversary, you know you have been anniversaryized. It is an event that I highly recommend. Everybody, just being in the Bethel church.
Yeah.
Vicki also does tours.
Okay.
If you are interested, she will not go in the basement because there are spiders. But I learned that the hard way when she pulled the thing. I'm not going down there. Well, okay, you're going down. Okay, so I went down. But the story of the church is that's also in our book, and Vicki could add more. But yeah, it's all so beautifully interconnected, and. You seem to find, and having done as most research, and Amy, you can repeat, I don't believe in coincidences. There are no such things, not in history.
Yeah.
There just aren't. So. All right, so we'll save the white officers for black troops for later. Which brings us to our meeting, since apparently I'm running the meeting too. Here we go, family.